a sec. Yeah, so just going to sort of run through where we are now and how we got to where we are and all of that. And I will start off just going through a little bit of history and yeah, acknowledging that we as Nat sort of went over globally for the whole country. But here we are on the unceded territory of Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And grateful to be here and doing this work. So I'm going to just do a little bit of background. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but a lot of what we're doing is focused on SROs and what we refer to as private SROs. So just so people have a bit of context for what we're talking about when we say that. So because a lot of this work that led to this land, like a lot of the, that's sort of how we got here, and the story of it began, many, many years ago before any of us even heard of a land trust. So the SRO hotels in Vancouver, basically, if you go back to the mid-1990s, in Vancouver, there are about 6,000, 6,000 to 7,000 SRO rooms, primarily in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And currently, today, there are about 50% of those hotels are owned and operated by the government and nonprofit partnerships, and then 50% still remain in private hands. But if you go back to the mid-1990s, all of them were privately owned, all of these hotels, but there was a big population shift happening in the neighborhood in the downtown east side around that time, as there were a lot of factors that led to that, but drug use was increasing. We sort of had a first overdose epidemic in the late 90s. We had very high rates of conversion to HIV, highest in the Western world. And also some large mental health, well, more like institutions like Riverview was a large place that closed down, and a lot of those people were put into community and ended up living in these SROs, and that to a certain degree overwhelmed the owners that were running these private hotels. And basically, a lot of those people were being put in these hotels, but they were being kicked out and evicted very often. At this point, it was very common to just and accepted that if someone used drugs, they didn't really have a right to housing, and it was normal for them to be kicked out of all forms of housing. So the homelessness was increasing quite rapidly. And the organization that I initially, before doing this job, worked for was called the Portland Hotel Society, and in 1992 set up in an SRO, one of the first ever Housing First models in Canada. I started to work for the organization in 1998, and at that time, we sort of convinced the government to buy a couple more of the SROs. So at this point, the organization I worked for was operating 3 of these SROs. And we had a housing first policy, a no eviction policy. We were very, open and accepting in our housing, and out of operating these hotels started to recognize a lot of other needs in the community, which is also sort of a factor in how our land trust is being operated. Meaning that we started out just running housing, but then quickly realized that people needed a bank, and people needed medical care, and people needed dental clinics, and people needed food, and people needed jobs. So we really started to work in the wider community on all of those things. And basically, the programs were quite successful in keeping people housed within this housing. And a case was really made that the government needed to do more and buy more of these SROs. Similar to today, they're not people's first choice of housing, and it's a little bit of a difficult place for us sometimes to be advocating for them to buy these SROs, because they're just a tiny little room with shared washrooms and kitchens, and they're not ideal. But at the same time, we currently have 3,500 units that are in private hands and that are being gentrified and upscaled and all that kind of thing. So protecting them is really important. And let me see what else I have here. Yeah, so basically, throughout the 2000s, the government continued to buy these SRO hotels. So like I said, when I first started, they were 100% almost privately owned, and now the government or nonprofits own 50% of that stock. However, as that model expanded of nonprofits running it, some of the sort of community aspects of the original Portland where I was working were lost, and they did take on a bit more of an institutional feel in some instances. And in the community, there is some resistance to even wanting to live in those buildings, because there are a lot of people in the community that don't actually require the supports and services that are offered in the not-for-profit housing, and they just, you know, simply don't have a lot of money and they just want a place to live. But unfortunately, as the private SROs are upscaled and gentrified, those people get pushed out, usually into homelessness. And then the only option left is a supportive housing unit, which is usually in one of the SROs operated by a not-for-profit partner, but that people don't really want to be there. They don't like the 24/7 staff or guest rules or cameras or whatnot. And certainly that model of housing is very needed for many people in the community, but it's not there for everyone, and it's sort of the only game in town right now. And then and the government also did do some full-scale renovations on a lot of these SROs. So one of the first hotels that we were operating, the Portland Hotel, that was renovated, and was a good example of what the potential that some of these old buildings have for redevelopment, where the number of units was cut in half, but they were all made to include their own kitchen and bathroom. And people really, they're sort of highly coveted units within the SRO portfolio because they do have their own kitchen and washroom. And then basically, yeah, so fast forward to about 2016, 17, 18, and I was still working at the PHS, and Wendy Peterson, who can't be with us today, but she basically focused a lot of her, she'd been organizing around housing issues in the downtown Eastside since probably the 1970s or 80s, something like that. But she really was focused at this point on the private SROs. So these were the buildings that didn't have the government support, about half of the stock. And in these buildings, there were some in the middle that were sort of well run and operated, but then there were some that really had fallen into just like horrible states of disrepair, just unimaginably awful. A lot of them were completely overrun by, you know, like criminal drug dealing, gangs, stabbings, you name it, happening in these buildings, as well as fire systems that didn't work, broken windows, you know, massive pest infestations, really run down. And initially she was trying to organize, because we have something called an SRA bylaw, which protects SRO rooms, and was trying to organize to get the city to actually enforce the bylaws, which allowed them to fine owners, so the city could carry out the repairs and then bill the owners for the cost of the repairs. But a couple of the buildings were in such horrible states that it in a way backfired, and those hotels were condemned and closed, which then led to more homelessness. And through that, to a certain degree, the focus was, you know, started to change into sort of organizing tenants in some of the better run buildings. And as the overdose epidemic was really picking up here, a lot of these private rooms didn't have Narcan training or staff available to intervene in overdoses. And Wendy and her group really started to just organize the tenants to do all of these things themselves, and they called it tenant-based initiatives. And so the SRO collaborative, and at this point I was still working at the PHS, I was the executive director at this point, and Wendy, we were partnering to some degree because they hadn't formalized as an organization yet, so they needed to sort of apply for grants under somebody else's charity status, which is quite common, and which is what our land trust ended up doing actually as well. So anyways, the SROC has basically grown since 2017 to now be operating in a very large portion of the private SROs, and it's very centered on the tenants and the capacity of the tenants to manage their own lives and to be doing a lot of the things that not-for-profit service providers hire staff to do. Instead, the tenants themselves are doing it. So the SROC doesn't have staff in any of these buildings. Their staff don't go and do the work. They simply organize tenants. They have things called bolts, and that's tenants that are, there's a lot of people that live in the buildings that worked in trades in the past. So those people are able to do some of the repairs and maintenance in these private SROs. They have food program, outreach organizers. They have tenant building committees. So those are kind of where they do monthly meetings and the tenants discuss things they would want. And if they want something like a laundry room, then that SRO collaborative will sort of help them maybe formulate letters to the landlord, but they won't go and talk to the landlord. Tenants will do it themselves. And they really would teach them a lot about the best way to approach a landlord and, how to kind of ask in a kind way. So they were able to create a lot of success with that. They also have fire safety programs where all tenants are trained on fire because there's a lot of fires in these SRO hotels. And basically, in doing that work, that they really started to recognize that although they were doing this work and these SROs were great, they were all still in the private market and they were all at risk of being sold. And many continue to be upscale, gentrified, etc. And basically, this was part of what led to the formation of the land trust, was this idea that it would be great for the community to own these buildings and run them in the same way that they're currently being run, but just where the ownership is secured. Because although the province continues to buy them, every time they buy them, they're handed over to a not-for-profit that runs it in a way that is quite different than the way the SROC is operating. So I think, yeah, I can hand it over now to Taffy.
Oh, Kathy, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Oops, sorry. Oh, hi everyone. My name is Kathy Shimizu. I use she, her pronouns. I'm excited to finally be able to make one of these CNCLT gatherings. I haven't had a chance to come, so thanks for coming to listen to us. I've worked for the Powell Street Festival Society in various roles since 1991. We operate in Powderguy, the Powell Street neighborhood, which is in the downtown Eastside. And as some of you may know, that some of the SROs actually are historically important buildings to the Japanese Canadian community. Our ancestors lived there, and until our community was uprooted from the neighborhood during the Second World War and incarcerated in internment camps. So, and in this, so a lot of us have social justice background, that we're part of the downtown East Side. And the Keefer is actually one of the buildings we're going to talk about, is a historic Japanese Canadian building. And I also work with the Downtown Eastside Community Land Trust to support community engagement. So I just wanted to give a bit of background about how we kind of got started. As Andy shared, the Downtown Eastside is a pretty special neighborhood, actually, even though there's all these challenges. You saw the photos. There's people are organized, the residents, and a lot of low-income people are organized, and they fought for what they have there: the Carnegie Community Center Insight, the safe injection site, a lot of the other things in the neighborhood. So I knew Wendy, and I've been a supporter and a volunteer for the collaborative since they started, and I knew Chris Livingstone before we started this work. But when COVID hit, these relationships and the mutual aid network that already existed really kicked into high gear. And a lot of downtown Eastside individuals and organizations were out in force because we really thought that everyone was going to die. And you might know that SRO, the single room occupancy hotels, have these shared bathrooms. And so you can imagine how worried everybody was about the spread of the virus. And Wendy brought a bunch of us together based on this call for 5,000 bars of soap for tenants. And so there was this new level of collaborating and organizing that was sort of unprecedented. We really started to share funding and resources, apply for grants together, and build these sort of neighborhood-wide projects. So here you can see that these are SRO tenants who are assembling grocery hampers that they're going to deliver to the SROs, where the collaborative had organized tenant leaders to deliver meals and hot meals and these food hampers. And they were also organizing in the building so those lead tenants would then distribute throughout the building and were building and as well as cleaning supplies and personal hygiene supplies, and they were continuing that harm reduction work that Andy talked about. And so these connections were being made on another level, increased level. And this, where they're assembling, is actually at the hub at 41 East Hastings, which is established during COVID, thanks to many groups. Atira donated the space. The city had been getting big donations of water and PPE and food containers and things, and the SRO Collaborative and Watati and Overdose Prevention Society and the Heart Tattoo Society were all operating programs. They were getting all sorts of donations, including the food rescue, about to expire groceries and fresh fruits and vegetables. And so in the next slide, you can see OPS and Heart Tattoo Society were getting these big grocery donations, but also Heart Tattoo Society does these big barbecues out on the street to feed people who are unhoused and precariously housed, including SRO tenants. And the next slide, you can see there's the Chinatown grocery program. So there's many Chinese seniors that live in SROs as well, and the SRO Collaborative supports them with language and this grocery hamper program. And so there's a lot of organizing what's happening in the downtown east side. And these discussions were emerging around the idea of this holistic housing model based on the work already being done by the SRO Collaborative that Andy was describing, and then what was happening during COVID, where tenants were hired to help with harm reduction, food sovereignty, basic maintenance, cleanup, mental health supports, and just fire safety and helping each other, neighbors helping each other, and also connected to this downtown east side bigger network of supporting folks who are low income and unhoused and precariously housed. And that we were talking about that the community should really own these buildings so that the tenants and the community could be involved in what happens to them, protect the low income housing and community spaces. The ground floor spaces often are or could be used as community spaces. And by owning the property, pushing back on gentrification and have some way to have a say in the development that happens in the downtown east side. So I'd met with Chris and Norm Leach, who from the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center, and Wendy is always having lots of conversations with lots of people. So we started meeting on Zoom every Friday. We were just talking about that before this. There was a lot of meetings. We would meet and try to figure out how we could own some of the SRs, and as Andy said, kind of keep the same model where the property management would stay in place, but really embedding the skills and energy enthusiasm of the tenants that the SRO Collaborative have fostered, and as a way that the buildings would be operated. So in the next slide, of course, we told our ideas. So the downtown east side, the Collaborative and VACPAC and the Pal Street Festival Society and Aboriginal Front Door and the Network of Inner City Community Services Society, we were all sort of doing this off the sides of our desks, and we were also holding funding. We weren't an actual organization. We were a bunch of groups and individuals that were interested in this idea, and we just kept meeting every Friday on Zoom to try to push it forward, see how we could move the idea forward. So in the next slide, and of course, we had told our ideas to our friend, amazing, inspiring knowledge keeper, Scundle Bernie Williams in the center there with the red vest, who's the lead carver of the survivors pole that Wendy has worked closely with Wendy. And she told Wendy and me that we really needed to get the advice of the elders. And she was, of course, right. And also you always listen to whatever Bernie tells you to do. So we gathered elders from the host nations, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and also from urban Indigenous elders, and also elders from the Japanese Canadian, Chinese Canadian, and South Asian communities that have history in the downtown east side, and these are groups that have history of displacement and dispossession. And so we started having these elders gatherings to talk about these ideas, get their advice, and really try to work from the ground up. So I'll let Chris continue with also the other community engagement work we've been doing, and that history.
Great, thank you, Kathy. It's sort of, I get excited when I listen to a little bit about the history of it, and I just think about all the synergy that happened in the very beginning that was able to get the groups together, and all the life-saving work that everybody's doing. But hello, everybody from. My name is Chris Livingstone. I'm from the West Coast here. On unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm happy to talk to the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts and talk a little bit about what we've been doing. So for the past couple of years, I actually wrote something, so I'm going to look at it and speak. But for the past couple of years, I've had the pleasure of learning about community land trusts, and for me, it's been a learning process. And for a while, I was hired on as community engagement and outreach, and so in some ways, I was sort of an unwilling participant. Mostly, I've been involved, like Andy. I'm connected to the downtown Eastside through the Woodwards occupation, living on the sidewalk for 7 months, as well as helping out with Insight. And we actually started the gorilla injection site before the real one came. But it was a lot of the community coming together to be able to help. But that's a little bit about my connection. But in the very beginning, we had a lot of energy, and I think a lot of the groups or organizations and people that heard about land trusts, they came and they attended, and I think people like the idea from the organizational side that an organization could own equity or be connected to the land and be able to feel those benefits as being a landlord and rather being stuck to pay rent. But so locally, we've been feeling the effects of losing hotels to fire, poor maintenance issues, skyrocketing rents, real estate commodifying and speculation. So we were thinking, how do we overcome serious issues of tenants and single room occupancy hotels, challenges faced by tenants, infestation, addiction, building maintenance, lack of cooking capabilities, and just general disconnection in general. So, because I believe there is a digital divide, and that people don't have access to cable or telephones or actual things like other people. So here we're taking a new approach to connect and overcome these challenges. At the center being the tenants who are living through and surviving and creating a new family of tenants. So these are them in the picture over there. There's quite a group of them. It's been a great experience getting to know them over the past couple of years, and really getting to that point that we're starting to function comfortably together. So we were able to get our tenants, and really with the help and consent of the SRO collaborative, we populated our tenant advisory committee, and we also came out with terms and references, and Ali even made a volunteer contract for everybody to sign off and really understand what they were getting into. For a short period, we rented a site on Main Street, a storefront location where we were able to get the tenants together, do surveys, have one-on-one sessions with tenants, and as well as get our information out to the public a little bit more. So we've got tenants that are involved are organizing sorry, Andy mentioned it more closely earlier, but basically with the tenants are involved in maintenance, harm reduction, cultural supports, fire safety, and food programming seems to be a really big one. The TAC members we found that are eager to share how they value volunteering in their buildings, and as well share victories and identify trouble areas. So there's also a desire that I believe that's been expressed over time that they want to expand into other privately owned SROs. So through these initial meetings, I think we began to understand that each building has its own culture, maintenance levels, and operational nuances. Some things that came up were plumbing, need for common space, heat response, fire safety, and connection opportunities. So the TAC is, or the Tenant Advisory Committee has also participated with the elders, and I've just got to sort of rerun over Kathy's stuff as well. No, not run over, but have it running alongside. So the original working group, those Friday group members that came together, I think they understood that we needed diverse people who were from the neighborhood and could help bring the group and plan to the community. So we've got elders from the Japanese community, representative from local nations, the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Chinese community, urban First Nations, to get together and provide a connected leadership compass for the society. So it's almost, I almost wanted, so I named two different Indigenous groups. So we have representatives that are part of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, which are the host nations of the unceded territory of Vancouver. And as well, we have people that are from the local Indigenous community, just the urban service organizations. So we've gotten together quite a bit over time, and with the help, I wanted to mention Norm. I think he's brought us together, and we were able to share some Indigenous governance tools, investigate the way that we make decisions as a group. Maybe we could go to the slide with the compare. Yes, that one. So Norm was great, and he shared with us, like I said, how to make decisions in different ways, and just different ways of thinking about us as an organization. And we're one of our goals is to decolonize our governance and our organization and keep it really connected to the people that are actually living in the spaces and existing in the community. So on the chart above, we've got some different ways of thinking about things. We like to think of things as in circles, like talking circles or spiral, or just ways that are connected and they able to loop around, rather than the colonial version of linear thinking, get from point A to point B. We like to think about how we're connected to nature versus man-made, spiritual as opposed to religious, balance as opposed to hierarchy, which is really kind of, I think, important in community land trusts, to make sure that we respect that balance. Spectrum versus binary, matrilineal versus patrilineal, connected versus disconnected, healing and balance versus crime and punishment. So in indigenous ways or views, there's many senses, and in the colonized view, there seems to be more, about five senses. Though I'm sure anybody's willing to argue that about that. Sure. Let's take a look at the next slide. Yeah. So we got these groups together, the indigenous elders, and as well as the tenant advisory committee, and we began to notice that these two worlds kind of clashed, or they weren't used to working together. So we talked about some good open rules that were able to keep things flowing. Very good tenants, respect, unity, determination, patience, hope, healing, support, and safety. To talk a little bit about the friction that we had. So we have got elders together, or the First Nations ladies. People weren't always versed in how to talk in a group setting, so there was a lot of cross talking or over talking, and a little bit of chaos. So we found out we were able to overcome those issues by implementing a First Nations talking stick type symbol. I'll move it so it keeps going. This time I've got a rattle, but we had a feather fan one time, but it's sort of a talking stick sort of a tool which was able to keep us all together, respectful, and be able to make sure that everybody gets a point of view and is able to contribute to discussions. Okay. Next slide. I'm not sure how many slides I have, but
Here, actually, Chris, maybe I'll go back a couple slides because we
Sure.
get some.
oh yes. Yeah, so this was a great event. We trialed an event. So as part of our, I think Alia mentioned it later, as part of one of our projects, we did interviews with a lot of our tenants, mostly tenants and not elders. But we did these interviews and talked about the conditions of the single room occupancy hotels, and then we were able to take that footage and put it together a little bit. And so everybody, that's all the tenants that are in that room, there's 17 members of the TAC, but they're all movie stars to some degree now. So there they are at the Cineplex, looking at kind of an introduction. It was a 6-minute video, I believe. Yeah. So as we touched a little earlier, we've had a lot of meetings over. So we meet every Friday, and as well as once a month we meet with tenants and elders. It's been a long run to kind of get where we're at. We've met with senators, attorney generals, now premier. He wasn't the premier at the time, but now he is. Housing managers, the housing heads, and all kinds of people that would let us in the door and sort of let us pitch our proposal, or pitch the idea of why a downtown Eastside community land trust would be important for the community. But those are basically the ways that we did it. We've engaged so far. I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm gonna take over for a bit and go back to the more decolonized side of things, because I'm going to talk about the grants and our funding and how we used it, basically. My name's Allie. I'm the Research and Policy Coordinator for the Downtown Eastside Community Land Trust. I've been in this role for about 3 years. So I started, in 2020 or 2021, before we were fully formed. It was still when we were all just kind of meeting at the Friday meetings as a random group of people. But then I was hired by one of the community partners. Basically, one of my first duties was to apply for grants to get dedicated funding for this project. So basically, the first grants that I applied for was the CMHC Demonstrations Initiative, which luckily was geared exactly towards community land trusts. So we received funding from that, as well as from the Community Housing Transformation Fund, Real Estate Foundation of BC, and then more recently, a racial justice grant from the BC Law Foundation. It's really important to note that when we were applying for these grants, again, we were not incorporated in any way. So we were actually relying on community partners to hold the grants for us. Like the CMHC grant is actually held by the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center Society, and our CHTC grant is held by Aboriginal Front Door Society. So we really relied on those community connections. One of the other challenges that I'm sure a lot of the community land trusts have faced is that there's not a lot of grants really designed for what we were trying to do. Most of the housing and capital grants are really aimed at focusing on new units, or are kind of more designed for traditional supportive housing units, which is not really the model that we're going for. So we were a bit limited in what we could apply for. We really had to focus on ones that were kind of more focused on like innovation and land justice, things like that. So once we got the grants, we kind of imagined it as we had like 2 major streams of work. One of them was the community development, which Chris just talked a lot about. So we did our monthly tenant and elder advisory committee meetings, other community events. Like Chris mentioned, we had some funding to interview tenants and create a short video of that. We did a big tenant survey using kind of the SRO collaboratives model, where tenants actually survey each other. And then the other arm of this community development was this kind of decolonizing governance work. So again, having Norm come in and do a lot of these decolonizing governance workshops to both explain kind of the colonized versus more decolonized ways of thinking. There was also a lot of talk about trauma tools. Obviously, in the downtown east side, there's just a ton of trauma, a ton of resilience, but a ton of trauma. So in order to really be able to work well together, it's kind of necessary to address some of the kind of communication barriers that this trauma can cause. So that's been a focus of ours. And then this other stream that we have is kind of the technical work. And this was definitely the stream that I'd say most people on our team were less familiar with. We came from a lot of community organizers and community activists, but we didn't really have as many like financial experts or real estate experts. So one of our first kind of orders of business was to find a consultant or an expert who actually had a lot of familiarity with the government side of things and like the BC housing side of things. We knew we were going to need to be making proposals and making arguments and making kind of financial documents that would explain our vision to the government in a way that would make them believe in it and believe in it enough to give us some money for it. So we were lucky enough kind of to be put in contact with who's now our acquisition consultant, named Craig Crawford. He has like 20 years experience working at BC Housing, including I think being like the vice president of operations. And it's kind of funny because while he was working at BC Housing, he was actually in like an oppositional role to some of our group members at the time. But we didn't actually see that as a negative. If anything, it was almost a positive to have someone who would be able to point out the holes or the flaws or what the government wouldn't like about our plan. Like we kind of needed that to be able to make a stronger argument. So we started working with Craig, and we knew that we needed to get kind of like a business case and a pro forma together. And the first element of that was actually narrowing down which buildings it was that we wanted to buy. So through our partnership with the SROC, they actually already had a pretty good idea of what was going on in all the buildings just from them working on the ground in all the buildings. So we had kind of already identified a portfolio of 8 buildings with a single owner who was looking to sell. And we were able to do a walking tour with the tenants to go through all of these buildings and really get a firsthand look at like how well they were managed, kind of what the repairs were that were needed. And then with the tenants, we also created just a list of other kind of prioritization criteria, other things that would make us want to buy a building, such as if the rents, how expensive the rents are, because obviously we would want to preserve kind of lower rent ones to ensure that people who need them the most are still in there. And we also wanted to look at buildings that already kind of had a lot of tenant-based initiatives operating in them. So through this work, we were able to identify our portfolio. We kind of created a full list of the order in which we wanted to buy them, but ideally we wanted to buy all of them at once, which I'll talk about in a second. It's also important to note that while we started to think about how to kind of make this case to the government for funding for these buildings, we really wanted to make sure that our plan kind of aligned with some of the existing governmental plans. And the city of Vancouver had actually released a couple of these SRO study and updates where they did all this analysis on the privately owned buildings and broke them down into groups. And this is one of the diagrams that they had. So they have the worst buildings in the private group, which are in the worst conditions, but they generally have the lowest rents. And on the other side is the investor buildings that generally have a lot better conditions, but have way higher rents. So our plan is really focused on these middle buildings, the ones that are still in okay condition and have like still relatively low rents, because we know the worst buildings will probably need to be completely redone, which we won't have the resources to do at this time. And the investor buildings are already kind of gentrified to a degree, so there's not much we can do about that. The other thing we needed in order to make a strong argument to the government was to get a really good board together. So at this point, we incorporated as a nonprofit, and before doing that, we were able to get a really great board. There has a lot of people who've been working in the community for a really long time. It's majority Indigenous with representatives from the host nations and just other people who are really kind of prominent in downtown Eastside community work. And we also, same with our staff and consultants, we just tried to amass like a really large group of people who we knew and whom we trusted and who had some of the skill set that maybe the people immediately working on this project did not have. So with all of this work, we basically created a proposal for the provincial government. Now, at the time, the province of BC had just announced a surplus of $6 billion, and they actually wanted to spend it, which was nice. They didn't put out any kind of request for proposals, but we knew they had this money to spend, so we knew that we just had to get something in front of them. And we were also really lucky that our premier, David Eby, actually got his start in the downtown east side and kind of really understood some of the issues in the neighborhood, which I think is more than a lot of people have with their government elected officials who are high up. So we kind of had, it was like a stars aligning moment where there was extra money. We had people in power who kind of understood what we actually were going through. So we gave them this proposal. We aimed really high. We wanted to buy all 8 buildings in this portfolio, because all 8 buildings together actually worked out financially. There was some commercial space that kind of helped subsidize the living costs of some of the housing units. So to buy all 8 buildings, we asked for $100 million. And in addition to that, we also included a proposal for 9 million for the SRO collaborative to continue their tenant-led initiatives in all the private SROs, because we knew that that was such a crucial component to our model. So here's just a little cutout from the proposal that kind of explains our plan. Craig, our consultant, was always telling us to like simplify and cut things out, and that people are only going to look at this for 10 minutes. So you have to make it kind of as clear and impactful as you can. So this was our very pared down version of the plan, which was basically to acquire these privately owned SROs. We wanted to maintain the private property manager, unlike a lot of other CLTs who want to kind of have nonprofit housing providers in there. We actually wanted to maintain the private ones. This is because we wanted it to still feel like independent housing. In the downtown east side, a lot of the nonprofit housing providers do have a more service heavy model, as Andy was discussing, which can feel more institutional. So we wanted this just to still feel kind of like a more independent housing where you're just paying your rent and you live there. But we wanted to complete more repairs on the building and expand tenant-led support. That's crucial. That's what we'd be doing with the SRFC. And then we were hoping to be able to use kind of this equity that we'd gained from all these buildings for other community benefits. So to purchase more community space or other buildings. And then finally, eventually redevelop the SROs into better housing, because we know that they're not ideal housing by any means right now. So we gave them this proposal. There's actually quite a lot of meetings back and forth. And ultimately what we wanted was rejected. But it wasn't all bad, because they did give the SRFC the 9 million that they requested to continue operating their programming and expanding their programming. And they kind of earmarked an additional 2 million for the downtown east side community land trust. So for us to continue building our capacity, which was great. They did a funny thing where they gave it all to the SROC. So then we kind of had to just do a bit more paperwork to get the collaborative to transfer us the funds. But it was really great because it has provided us this 2 million has provided us a level of security for the next few years. We kind of have set aside hopefully 1 million of it to put towards an acquisition, should we be able to fundraise some other money to join that. We were also able to hire an executive director, Andy, which was great. He's really, obviously has a ton of experience in this. And one of the issues that the government had that they kind of voiced to us over our proposal was that they felt like our group didn't really have enough demonstrated experience necessarily. So being able to hire such a great executive director who's had so much experience really just helps the group in general. Another good thing that came about from this proposal was that we were actually able to meet face-to-face with these different government officials to explain the urgency around the SROs and what the actual issues were. So that felt like it kind of made the point come across more clearly, especially around one SRO, which is the Kiefer, which Andy will talk about in a second, which basically it went through a fire. So it was completely untenanted. And as it had no tenants in it, it's a way more attractive buy to a lot of private investors because they can charge whatever they want for rents when they move people in. So we really tried to highlight that SRO was at high risk of being completely lost as affordable housing and as community space. And maybe on that note, Andy, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so I'm mindful of time because we are coming close to our hour. We're not super slick here in our presentation, so we might just go over, but understand if people need to leave and go to other things. I think it is being recorded. And there's not too much more to go through. So really, I had left the downtown east side in about 2020. That could be a whole other presentation, but I had moved to Ukraine fully. My whole life was there. I was living there. And then of course the war broke out. I was still continuing to live there. But people were contacting me about this opportunity. And I was sort of considering coming back to Vancouver, of course, and I left the downtown Eastside after 20-some years, feeling a little stressed, but finding myself living in a war zone was more stressful. And anyway, so yeah, I went through the interview process and was hired, and I started in my role as executive director. I was still actually in Ukraine, but I was on the Zoom meetings with these guys starting, I guess, last August. Then I returned to Vancouver in October, and one of the first things we were doing when I was hired was negotiating this building, Kiefer Street building, which had had the fire. So the province had committed to the land trust operating it. And I guess just one of the overarching things about how we came to be is, as you can see from the presentation we've gone through, there was really years of work before the land trust even existed. Because sometimes it can feel hard to start these things. So it's not like a group of people got together and did all the paperwork and started it and then started doing work and meetings. Like the land trust kind of came way after. But be that as it may, this when this project came up, and where we're still sort of at is the government agreed that the land trust could operate it on our model with tenant-based initiatives, but they didn't want to commit to the ownership piece. So that was sort of a battle that we were having for a few months, because we had worked in these buildings so much and we had developed a close relationship with the owner. The purchase and sale agreement to purchase this building, we made sure that the land trust had this offer, so it was between the land trust and the owner. But so for the government to buy this building, they needed our land trust to assign our basically our right to purchase it over to them, which was our only sort of bargaining chip, but it wasn't really enough. Like, and at the end of the day, they wouldn't commit to just giving us the building. And again, they were saying we needed to demonstrate our experience. And I think me being hired helped. I knew a lot of those people at the government. I worked at the PHS for 20 years, and we ran over 20 SROs in the downtown east side, and so they were aware that I had a lot of experience doing this and working in these SROs, but they still were not comfortable to give us the asset. They said, and there was a little bit of almost confused. They couldn't understand why we weren't happier about this whole arrangement, but we really needed to press them that the ownership piece was pretty key for us, and that was the whole point of the land trust. And we didn't want to just be a service provider, but they're just so used to owning the building and hiring a nonprofit to run it. They're trying to put us into that model. So be that as it may, we did agree. Right now we're still finalizing the operator agreement, and what we're trying to do is just build something into this agreement that says after 2 years of successful operation, ownership will be transferred, hopefully for a nominal fee of $10. There's some discussion about a forgivable 25-year mortgage. We would prefer to just own the asset, but so those discussions are ongoing. It still is empty, but we're hopeful that we'll have some sort of an arrangement where we can get the ownership of that building eventually. And then basically the other things that we focused on in having this money was basically, once again, we were back at the year end and we knew there was somewhat of a surplus. And so we decided to put together another proposal. And one thing that happened when we attended the land trust conference that was in Toronto in October and met many of you, and I was really new to the land trust landscape, so it was great for me. It was such a great conference, and I learned so much listening to everyone. But I was in one of the presentations by some by the group from BC colleagues. I don't know if they're on here or not, but from Tom Armstrong and Tiffany, and I was in one of their presentations, and they were talking about how they had a $500 million fund for people in BC to buy buildings. And I got really excited, and I started texting all the other people at the conference in my group saying this is great news. And everyone started laughing at me and said, no, that fund excludes SROs. So that SROs were not allowed to be part of that fund. I don't know exactly why, the politics of that, I won't go into that. But so basically what we did is, it was coming up to year end, so we focused our efforts onto creating another proposal to basically mimic that fund in BC, because we knew the government understood it, even though they were telling us on one hand that they didn't really understand what the focus on ownership was. On the other hand, they had created this proposal because clearly they did understand the importance of preserving the rentals. And so we basically put together another proposal, and we just asked for a bigger number this time. We asked for $200 million to set up an SRO protection fund that was basically a lot of the similar language from their existing rental protection fund. We left it somewhat vague. We're not saying all the money would be for us. It could be for other nonprofits as well, but it really would be focused on the SROs. And so that is sort of a big part of what we continue to do. And we just really have met with a lot of politicians around that. And then we also, I'm going to wrap it up because of time, but we also are just focused on the general policy stuff, continuing to have our meetings, continuing to build momentum in the community, you know, and also we're now putting together a sort of task force to look at trying to purchase a second building that we will do possibly without the help of the government, to really show our initiative and demonstrate our model. Because although we have the Kiefer building, there was a fire, and it's going to be probably at least a year until it's even operational. So we've had all this project or all this success to certain degrees, and there is definitely a lot of momentum. But at the same time, as of today, we still don't own and operate a building yet. So just to be clear on that. So you know, we're getting closer and closer, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and I guess running alongside this work around acquiring the SROs, another big piece that the activists in the community have been working on, and I'll just end on this because it is a success, was vacancy control within the SROs. So there was a big movement to do this. The city was on board. They tried to enforce vacancy control, not across the entire province, specifically for the SROs as a mechanism of the SRO bylaw, but it was shot down in court. The city appealed that decision. It was lost. They were trying to appeal it to another court, but then Wendy and her group for the last months have been working tirelessly on this issue in a very creative way, and just meetings and phone calls and tremendous amounts of effort. And just in the last about 48 hours, the provincial government, they managed to get them on board to enact a special clause called MIVA, which allowed them to sort of override this decision and force the vacancy control for the SROs. So that just went through for SROs in Vancouver in the last 48 hours, which is big because it's going to stop all these renovictions that are happening. The fines are going to be, they're very, very huge if people are trying to not follow these rules. It's something like $10,000. I forget the details, but massive fines. So basically, this idea that people can just clear out a building and then renovate it and raise the rents is just not going to be possible in the SROs. And it will also keep values down because speculative buyers and developers are not going to want to touch these buildings now because it's going to be much more complicated to renovate them. So that's all. I'll stop.